They say the past never really dies. It just waits, buried in the soil, whispering through the wind, crawling beneath the rotted floorboards of old American houses. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, Pennsylvania, there's one family whose name was spoken only in hushed tones: the Millers. For decades, their story was sealed away like a coffin no one dared to open. But every secret, no matter how deeply it's buried, eventually demands to be heard. The Millers were respected once, a family of landowners, churchgoers, and God-fearing souls. Their farmhouse sat high on a hill, watching over the valley like an old sentinel. People said they had good blood, strong, pure, untainted. But purity has a way of curdling when it's guarded too closely. And what began as a proud family legacy soon twisted into something unspeakable. It started with a child who wasn't supposed to exist, a child that bore the face of its own uncle. The town whispered, but no one dared confront them. The Millers had money, influence, and a way of making things disappear. Those who asked too many questions simply stopped asking. One night in the winter of 1932, the last candle in the Miller farmhouse went out. The snow fell silent, and by morning, the entire family was gone. No bodies, no footprints. Just the house, empty, except for the smell of iron and something else as something old. When the sheriff arrived, he found the cellar door ajar, and inside carvings. Dozens of them. Names, dates, and symbols that didn't belong to any church in the county. For nearly a century, the Millers became a ghost story told to scare children. But the truth, the real truth, is far darker, because a set of letters was found not long ago, hidden in the walls of that same farmhouse. Letters written by the last surviving Miller, and in those trembling words lies the confession of what really happened in that house and why the family vanished. Because sometimes evil doesn't come from outside the home. Sometimes it's born within it, passed down like a curse, wearing a family name like a disguise. And this is the story they tried to erase. The letters were discovered by accident. In 2019, a contractor named James Harlan bought the Miller property, intending to restore it for a bed and breakfast. The farmhouse had been abandoned for generations. Windows shattered, roof caved in, the walls bloated from years of water and silence. He said the air inside was thick, like breathing through a wet cloth. When he tore down one of the upstairs walls, a bundle of papers slid out from behind the plaster. The pages were brittle, yellowed, tied with what looked like human hair. The first letter was dated November 1931. The handwriting, delicate, almost childlike, belonged to a woman named Eleanor Miller, the daughter of patriarch Samuel Miller, and as the letter revealed, the keeper of a terrible family truth. "I write this knowing it may damn my soul," she began. "Our name is not what it seems. What we have built was never meant to touch the light. Father says it began to protect the bloodline, but I have seen what protection becomes when it turns to obsession." Her words described the Miller family's purity pact, a ritual bound by blood and marriage, designed to keep the family untainted by outsiders. It was more than inbreeding, it was a belief that their blood carried something divine. Samuel Miller preached that their ancestors were chosen, touched by God himself, and that diluting their lineage would invite judgment. But Eleanor saw what it did to her siblings. Her brother Thomas was born with eyes that never focused, his skin pale and thin as paper. Her sister Ruth never spoke a word in her life, and yet Samuel called them miracles, proof that their sacrifice pleased heaven. Eleanor's second letter was shorter. The handwriting had changed, frantic, trembling. She wrote of screams in the night, of her father digging in the orchard, of a guest who came and never left. The tone shifted from confession to terror. Then came the third letter, the one that stopped Harlan cold. In it, Eleanor said she was carrying a child, not by choice, and that the father was of our own blood. She wrote, "He says it is the will of our ancestors, but I see no angels here, only monsters with my family's face." The last line was a warning, scrawled so violently it tore the page. "If anyone finds this, leave this place buried. Our blood is not meant to mix with the living." James Harlan never finished the restoration. Within months, the property was sold again, quietly, without explanation. But before he left, he told a friend something chilling, that every night, as he slept in the farmhouse, he could hear whispering from the walls. Not words, just a sound, like breathing. When word of the letters spread through Maple Hollow, the town didn't know what to believe. Some said it was all a hoax. the kind of story people tell to make sense of old ruins and bad luck. But others, the older ones, went quiet. They remembered. They remembered the nights the Millers locked their gates, the strange glow in their orchard after midnight, the way the youngest children in town used to vanish for days and come back different. Local historian Martha Green became obsessed with the case. She spent 2 years combing through county records, church archives, even private family diaries. What she found was a pattern: marriages and deaths that didn't add up, birth certificates with missing fathers, burial plots with no bodies, and one particularly disturbing record from 1894, a stillborn child listed as both son and nephew of the same man. According to Martha, the Miller family's isolation wasn't just social, it was deliberate. For over a century, they married only within their own bloodline, their property stretching back to land grants signed after the Revolutionary War. But that wasn't the strangest part. Deep in the archives, she found a sermon written by Samuel Miller himself, preserved on brittle parchment, the ink almost faded to brown. It read like scripture, but darker. Samuel wrote of the covenant of flesh, a promise to preserve divine blood, untainted by the sickness of outsiders. He claimed that their ancestor Elias Miller had been visited by a radiant being in the field, who marked his bloodline for eternity. Those born of his seed, it said, must never mix with the world, or the gift shall curdle into curse. To the townsfolk, it was madness, but to Samuel it was gospel. Martha visited the old Miller property in early spring. She described finding something strange in the basement, a hidden room beneath the cellar floor. The walls were lined with jars. Inside them were fragments of bones, tufts of hair, even small teeth. Each jar was labeled with a name and a date. The most recent one read Eleanor, 1932. She said the air was colder there, not just from the earth, but from something older, something that didn't want to be remembered. When Martha left the house, she swore she heard someone humming upstairs. A woman's voice, faint but real. Weeks later, she stopped her research entirely. Friends say she burned all her notes and refused to speak about the Millers again. But before she disappeared from public life, she said one last thing in an interview. They weren't protecting their blood. They were feeding it. After Martha's silence, the Miller story might have faded again. Just another ghost tale swallowed by time. But the human need to uncover what's forbidden is stronger than fear. A podcast host named Richard Lorne reignited the investigation in 2021. He specialized in unsolved American folklore, haunted towns, missing families, whispers of cults. But even he admitted, the Millers felt different. Their story didn't sound like a myth, it felt like a warning. Richard began interviewing descendants of people who once worked on the Miller farm. Most refused to speak on record. One, an elderly woman named Nora Price, finally agreed under one condition: her face would never be shown. She had been a maid in the farmhouse when she was 16. They were polite, she said, but the kind of polite that feels like being watched. She told Richard about the upstairs rooms. Windows nailed shut, curtains sewn to the walls, a sweet, metallic smell that clung to the floors, and the sound of someone crying, not loud, not desperate, just soft, endless sobbing that echoed through the hall at night. Sometimes I'd hear it coming from the attic, she whispered, sometimes from under the floor. When asked why she stayed, she said something that made the room go silent. Because once you enter that house, it doesn't let you go until it's ready. Richard didn't believe in curses. He was a skeptic, a rational mind chasing irrational stories. But the deeper he dug, the more reality began to fracture. Records vanished from local archives the day after he requested them. The sheriff's office reported a break-in at the evidence room. Only one file stolen, the Miller family case from 1932. A few weeks later, Richard uploaded his final episode. In it, he sounded different. The usual confidence in his voice was gone. He said, "I think I've found something that wasn't supposed to be found." He described an unmarked grave behind the Miller orchard. He'd uncovered it himself, following coordinates mentioned in one of Eleanor's letters. Beneath the soil, he found a small coffin, barely large enough for a child. But inside, there was no skeleton, just dirt and a single note folded and dried despite the decades. The note read, "The blood remembers, it calls us home." That was the last episode he ever posted. His car was later found abandoned near Maple Hollow, doors unlocked, engine cold. His equipment was missing. his keys still in the ignition, and yet, when the police turned on the car radio, a recording played through the static. Richard's voice, whispering, almost pleading. "They're still here." By then, the story of the Millers had become something else entirely. It wasn't just history anymore, it was alive again. The house had been boarded up after Richard's disappearance, but locals swore the lights inside flickered some nights. The sheriff dismissed it as trespassers, but the old-timers said the family was awake again. That someone, or something, had disturbed the ground they swore would never be opened. A month after Richard vanished, a group of urban explorers visited the property. They streamed everything live, grainy footage, unstable audio, nervous laughter cutting through the dark. For the first half hour, it was the same as every other ghost hunt. Dust, silence, bad jokes. But at the 32-minute mark, one of them, a girl named Kayla, found something strange: the nursery. The walls were covered in handprints, dozens of them, small and faded, pressed into the plaster like fossils. In the center of the room stood an old wooden crib. Inside it, a porcelain doll with glass eyes and real human hair. One of the boys joked, "Creepy, but worth a picture." Then the feed went black. When the stream came back 15 minutes later, the room was empty. The camera lay on its side, facing the wall. All you could hear was breathing, steady, close, rhythmic. Then a voice, a whisper. It said, "Why did you come back?" Authorities searched the property the next day. They found the explorer's van, doors open, engine still running. Inside, the phone that had streamed the footage. No one inside, no footprints leaving the property. To this day, that stream remains online, but anyone who's watched it claims there's something else you can hear if you listen closely enough. Not just breathing, but a heartbeat. Slow, deep, almost human. And if you turn up the volume at the end, right before the static cuts out, you can hear a single word whispered through the noise. Miller. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent or tried to break the curse? Because some legacies don't die, they wait. And somewhere beneath the cold earth of Maple Hollow, the blood of the Millers is still listening, waiting for another name to call home. When the footage from the explorers began spreading online, the story drew attention from far beyond Maple Hollow. Paranormal investigators, journalists, even amateur historians started showing up, each convinced they could uncover the truth. But what they didn't realize was that every new visitor seemed to stir something deeper. One of the first to arrive was Dr. Andrew Keene, a cultural anthropologist from Boston University. His focus wasn't ghosts. It was belief systems, the psychology of isolation, how families create myth to survive shame. He thought the Millers were a case study in generational madness. The covenant, he wrote, was likely a means of control, a ritualistic excuse to keep power and property confined within the bloodline. But after 3 days in the farmhouse, Keene's notes took a turn. His handwriting, usually crisp and clinical, grew erratic. "There are markings here," he wrote, "carved deep into the beams. Not English, not Latin, some form of code or invocation. The lines twist inward, like they're meant to pull something through." He stopped returning calls. When his research assistant drove out to find him, she discovered his rental car still parked in the gravel drive. Inside the farmhouse, there were signs he had been living there. Open notebooks, cold coffee, half-eaten bread. But the strangest thing was the smell. The assistant described it later: copper and rot, like the air after a lightning strike. On the kitchen table lay his final journal entry. Only 2 words were written in shaky script: "It moves." But no one knows what that meant. But locals claim that after Keene vanished, strange sounds began echoing through the valley, low, animal groans that carried over the hills. Some said it was wind. Others swore it came from underground. And then, there were the birds. For nearly a week, crows blanketed the orchard trees, thousands of them, shrieking from dawn until dusk. When they finally scattered, the ground was littered with small bones, too small to be animal. By now, Maple Hollow had learned its lesson: don't dig, don't question, don't visit the Miller land. But for some reason, people kept coming. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else, a pull, a whisper. A memory that wasn't theirs but felt like it was calling their name. Because once you've heard the Miller story, it doesn't leave you. It lingers. It was around this time that the government finally intervened. The Miller property was officially condemned, deemed a structural hazard due to unstable foundations and chemical contamination in the soil. But the townspeople knew better. They'd seen too many hazards get sealed off when something stranger was found inside. Still, for a brief moment, the quiet returned to Maple Hollow. The farmhouse was fenced off, the path overgrown, and the story of the Millers began to fade again, until the rains came. That spring, relentless storms soaked the valley, flooding basements and washing out the old orchard road. One night, after the third consecutive downpour, a sinkhole opened behind the Miller property. By morning, pieces of the past had been unearthed, fragments of wood, glass jars, bones. Hundreds of bones. The sheriff tried to contain it, but word spread fast. Journalists arrived, drones circled overhead, and soon everyone could see it. A shallow pit stretching nearly 40 feet wide, filled with remains. Anthropologists dated the site between 1870 and 1930. Too many bones for a single family. Too many children. Among the artifacts recovered was a rusted metal cross, crudely shaped and engraved with a single phrase, "We feed the root." That line reappeared in Samuel Miller's writings, the patriarch's private journals, which had never been made public. They described a ritual known as the rooting. According to him, it was performed once every generation to keep the blood awake. Samuel wrote of feeding the soil with sacrifice from within, claiming that through the earth, their ancestors spoke and sustained the flesh. Some experts dismissed it as metaphor, a delusion of religious mania. But one passage in particular sent a chill through even the most skeptical readers. The body dies, it rid, but the blood remembers. The ground beneath the house must never hunger, or it will call for us all. When excavation crews dug deeper, they found something beneath the pit. A hollow chamber lined with limestone. At its center stood a stone basin, filled not with water, but with hardened black residue. Samples later confirmed it contained high levels of iron and human DNA from at least 7 individuals. The excavation was halted immediately. The area was reclassified, fenced off, and marked as a federal archaeological site. But a week later, the fence was gone, torn open from the inside. That same night, residents reported hearing music drifting down from the hill, faint, old-fashioned, like a lullaby played on a broken music box. For months after the excavation, the town seemed to exist in a kind of waking dread. Power outages became frequent. Livestock went missing, and people started talking about dreams, the same dream shared by dozens across Maple Hollow. In it, they were standing in a field of black soil under a red sky. The air was heavy and wet, and somewhere, beneath their feet, something was breathing. Each dream ended the same way, a voice whispering their name, followed by one last word, Om. The local pastor tried to calm people, calling it collective hysteria, the result of trauma and gossip. But deep down, no one believed him. The church itself began to change. Strange symbols appeared etched into the pews overnight. The old cross in the vestibule fell from the wall and split cleanly in two. The nightmares spread beyond Maple Hollow. Online forums dedicated to the Miller case began filling with stories from strangers across the country. People who had never been to Pennsylvania, who had only watched one of the videos or read about the case online. Yet they all described the same red sky dream, the same whisper. It was as if the story itself had become infectious, a living thing moving through words, through curiosity, through memory. The blood, in a way, had found a new way to travel. One of the posts came from a woman in Ohio who claimed to be a distant descendant of the Millers. She said she'd grown up hearing family whispers about the ones who stayed behind. In her message, she mentioned finding an old pendant in her grandmother's chest, a tarnished locket containing a lock of hair and a single dried seed. Inside was an inscription nearly identical to the one found on the cross, "We feed the root." 2 days after posting her story, her account went dark. Neighbors reported her house standing open, lights on, no one inside. The police found only the locket lying on the kitchen counter, split down the middle like something had burst from within. From that night on, the Miller house was no longer empty. Hunters passing through the woods claimed to see a candle flicker in the upstairs window, though the electricity had been cut for years. And if you stood at the edge of the orchard long enough, you could hear what sounded like a woman's voice humming, the same lullaby the town had heard the night the ground gave way. But this time, The song had words, and they weren't meant for the living. The humming grew louder with every passing week, though no one dared to climb that hill anymore. Maple Hollow's population began to dwindle. People moved away, businesses closed, even the church boarded up its windows. The town had become a hollow echo of itself, as if the land had finally taken back what was owed. But not everyone left. A young journalist named Claire Donovan came to Maple Hollow that winter, determined to finish what Richard Lorne had started. She didn't believe in curses or hauntings. To her, the Miller story was a test of courage, of truth against superstition. She carried a recorder, a flashlight, and Eleanor's letters printed on thin, crumpled paper. On her first night, she recorded everything: her steps crunching through the frost, the creak of the front door, the echo of her own breathing. "It smells like rust and old wood," she whispered into the recorder. "There's a piano in the corner, half the keys missing, but one of them just played itself." The tapes recovered later captured something strange. A second voice, soft, distant, female, whispering words beneath Claire's own. At first, it was indecipherable, like a hum in the static. But as she descended into the cellar, the whisper began to form into words. "They kept us in the earth." Claire's breathing quickened. "Who's there?" she said. The voice answered, not in anger, in sorrow. "We are the root." The sound that followed was unlike anything human, a long, dragging exhale that seemed to shake the walls. The recorder cut off there, but the final second of audio captured one unmistakable thing: a heartbeat. Not hers. Slow, heavy, and deep. When investigators arrived days later, they found the recorder at the top of the cellar stairs. Claire's coat was still hanging on a chair. Her car sat in the driveway, doors locked from the inside. But Claire herself was gone. The house was sealed for the last time after that, or so they said. Weeks later, a new video appeared on Claire's abandoned social media account. Just 15 seconds long. The screen was black, the audio distorted. But in the last few seconds, a faint voice whispered one line, a line from Eleanor's final letter. "Our blood is not meant to mix with the living." And then, faintly beneath it, laughter. A child's laughter. In the end, the Miller story became more than just a dark chapter in American folklore. It became a mirror, a reflection of what happens when obsession outlives reason, when bloodlines turn inward and call it purity. The farmhouse still stands, though no one lives there now. The county calls it condemned, the state calls it private property. But on quiet nights, when the fog rolls through the valley, people swear they can see a lantern glowing in the upper window, swaying as if someone is still walking the halls. No one knows who first built the house anymore. Records before 1810 have vanished, the graves in the orchard are unmarked, and the soil around the property seems to reject everything planted in it. Even weeds won't grow. The land feels drained, hollowed out, as though the life has been taken, drop by drop, and fed to something older beneath. Some say that's all it ever was, the earth feeding on the living, one generation at a time, a family that mistook their own decay for divine purpose. But others, the ones who've stood on that hill, say the truth is much worse. They say if you press your ear to the ground near the orchard, you can still hear them. The Millers. Whispering. Breathing. Waiting. And the whispers aren't random. They call names. Sometimes local names, sometimes the names of those who've read too much, listened too long, or dared to dig too deep. Because the blood remembers. It always remembers. The story of the Millers isn't a haunting. It's a contagion. A sickness that spreads through curiosity, through the telling, through you listening right now. Every word spoken, every image imagined, every heartbeat that quickens and fear feeds it just a little more. That's what Eleanor tried to warn us. That's what the letters were trying to bury. Maybe that's why the house still stands. Because as long as the story is told, it doesn't need walls. It doesn't need graves. It just needs ears to hear and eyes to see. So if you ever find yourself driving through Pennsylvania and you see an old farmhouse on a lonely hill, don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't listen if you hear your name. Because the Millers never really died. They're just waiting for the next one to come home.